Okay, well, welcome everybody to this the second meeting of the relaunched IRM ERM and Insurance Special Interest Group. I'm Justin Elks and I co-chair this group with Isaac Alfon, and the topic of today's meeting is ESG in insurance, surveying the landscape. And before we get started, I'm just going to spend a short 5 minutes to remind you about the focus of the group and ask a few questions to make sure this and future sessions are targeted appropriately for your needs. So a brief recap of the group. The idea really is to cover topics with a particular relevance for practitioners and other stakeholders in enterprise risk management in the insurance industry. This group now includes the previous internal model industry forum, which I know added a lot of value in the run-up to Solvency II. Last session on board risk governance was in insurance was well received, and we're really keen for this group's agenda to be member-led. We have a small working group to make sure we keep a focus on your concerns. And as always, if there are any topics you'd like to see covered, any ideas about thought leadership or any feedback that you'd like to give, please do get in touch with Isaac or myself. So to start, to help us to target this and future sessions, we've just got 3 upfront polling questions for you to answer using the polling functionality in the chat. So the first one is, which type of business do you work for? Okay, that's great, thank you. So looks like a good 2/3 insurers, sort of 15–16% consultants, and about 8% brokers. Okay, thank you. Next question is, which subsector of the insurance market describes your main area of expertise? Okay, that's great. So it looks like a good sort of close to 50% general insurance, a good 20% Lloyd's, and a good sort of 15–20% life as well as part of that. So final question. Who do you report to in your organization? Okay, that's great. That looks like a real mix of people, from people in risk functions to people on the C-suite and reporting into the C-suite as well. That's great. Thank you for that. So onto the session. As I'm sure you all know, ESG, sustainability and climate change are key topics for the insurance industry. Insurance is all about understanding long-term risk and using that understanding to serve our customers. And climate change is arguably one of the most urgent risks facing the world at the moment, and one where insurers need to be resilient and adapt to the long-term threats, as well as playing a key role in the economy, supporting businesses to manage their risks and providing long-term finance. So unsurprisingly, it's also becoming an area of regulatory focus and attention, as we've seen over the last few months. So I'll hand over now to Isaac to introduce the session and to get us started in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for that. So I suppose, I'll start by saying welcome to everyone. I think both Justin and I are very excited to have the opportunity to go into ESG and start to understand what it really means for insurers. And our vision for this seminar is reflected in the title. There is a landscape. There is ESG in insurance, which is already a reality. Environmental, social, and governance considerations are now part of how insurers are operating on a day-to-day basis, reflecting to a large extent the increased focus on corporate sustainability. And obviously, the title also reflects that we are looking at a landscape that has a number of components, and a landscape that we are going to seek to cover between two sessions, today's session and another one in 2021. For that session in 2021, there will be a couple of questions at the end about the focus of that session. But before that, let me just share with you what's a kind of model that Justin and I had in mind when we were starting to scope this session. So, I think everyone is aware that there are a set of external drivers shaping ESG in terms of public perceptions in society, and then there are also external drivers in terms of government policy and regulation. Those two external drivers feed directly into insurers, which is represented by the red box at the bottom of this slide. They also affect the perspective and expectations of debt and equity investors in insurance companies. Then, once you look inside an insurance company, we could see that, broadly speaking, there will be a number of layers. But there was a layer about the internal arrangements for managing ESG in insurance. Then there were three different perspectives that insurers seem to be considering on an ongoing basis as owners of assets, in terms of product development and underwriting, and in terms of a corporate perspective. And obviously, you can see quickly that perhaps the last one is perhaps much more common or shares a great deal with what other corporates have to think in terms of ESG. And last but not least, there are disclosures. And the green ticks that you can see in these slides reflect what we expected to cover today. Obviously, as we said, this is a very wide canvas, and we intend to come back and cover some of the other bits that we have not covered today, or perhaps some of what we have already covered. And as I said, we would like to get your input about that. So today we are very lucky to have three superb speakers, each one an expert in its area, to help us navigate through the journey. So first of all, we've got an overview of the development of ESG by Rebecca Correa, an institutional investor's perspective of ESG and insurance by Jean Wee Tan, and last but not least, a CRO and an insurer's journey into ESG by Alex Hanson. And each one will speak for 10 to 15 minutes and set out how he sees the subject matter of ESG from his perspective, obviously. And then we will have a Q&A session at the end of each session. We will also have an opportunity for more Q&A at the very end of the third presentation. And I think you can see in the system the facility for asking questions, and we will encourage you to use that. And we will obviously do our best to cover as many as possible. We are grateful for all the many attendees that are here today, 74 of you. So I think if everyone asks just a question, we will have more than enough. So without further ado, then I'd like to move to the first speaker, Rebecca Correa. Rebecca is the head of stewardship at Lombard Odier Investment Management. Rebecca leads Lombard Odier stewardship activities with a focus on sustainability, corporate governance, and ESG analysis. She has more than 10 years of experience advising institutional investors on issues relating to corporate governance and ESG, with a focus on leveraging these issues to create sustainable long-term value for clients and beneficiaries. Rebecca has had previous roles with Investec Asset Management and companies advising investment managers on both. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Isaac and Justin, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Well, we now live in a world where ESG has entered the mainstream, and during my presentation, I would like to unravel some of these acronyms and describe the journey that has led us to where we are today as an investor community. I also wanted to suggest how and why the dial has moved and why ESG for the insurance industry is so important. And in doing so, I will be threading in some history and highlighting the role that local UK regulatory institutions have played in making ESG part of investments. But also, and finally, I want to share the ESG, sustainability obligations and aspirations that we see. So just going back to basics a little bit. First of all, what is ESG? Of course, it stands for environmental, social, and governance. But what I wanted to highlight is that ESG is the two sides of the same coin. Is the side on the companies, and for companies, ESG is the way in which they consider environmental, social, and governance factors in their operations, but it's also the side of the investors, for whom ESG are factors that impact the investment opportunities and that are seen as potentially very important drivers of portfolio risk and return. And of course, ESG factors cover a very wide range of issues that traditionally have not been part of financial analysis. However, there are issues that have financial relevance. So some brief examples for environment. We can think about how companies manage climate change, what they're doing with their stranded assets, if they have any, biodiversity, land use, etc. For social issues, we can look at how companies treat workers. Do companies use slave labor or child labor? How companies interact with their supply chain? And lastly, the G in governance refers to the systems of rules, practices, and processes by which companies are governed. And examples of these are many. I wanted to highlight two other considerations. One is that ESG factors, although we put them in three different buckets, are really very interlinked. And we usually find when we talk about one of them that the other two come into play. And the second consideration is that ESG may have indeed been created equal, but the resources and our own understanding, expectations, and aspirations for E, S, and G have not been equal. I think we can all agree that historically governance has taken most of the attention, and it is pretty well established. And lately, in the last 5 to 8 years, we have had the environmental issues and the social issues pushing for more importance. And in my view, I think the pressure for more attention to the E is coming from the regulator, but also from investors and society, and the pressure for more S is coming from staff, company staff, and investors. I want to spend a little bit of time on corporate governance because I think it really exemplifies how the investment community identified an issue that went from small to big, and it also shows how the local UK regulators led the way in creating new responsibilities and new concepts, both for companies and investors. And then these responsibilities and concepts have really spread over to other jurisdictions. And what I talk about are the corporate governance codes and the stewardship codes. Very briefly, 1992, so the Cadbury report that set out principles for good corporate governance, which we now take for granted. For example, that there should be a separate chairman and CEO, and that the board should have at least 3 non-independent directors, with 2 of whom being independent of management. That report also set the requirement for audit committees to exist and to be comprised of non-independent directors. If we think about that report from our 2020 standing point, it looks quite naive, but it was setting the ground for what was going to come back later. So we look at the corporate governance and how the UK regulators have since 1992 until the latest revision in 2019 of the UK Corporate Governance Code, how the expectations of companies have changed. Right now, the latest code asks companies to report on how they, what is their culture, how they integrate culture with the company strategy, how they look at diversity. And then on the other side of the coin, what are the regulators' expectations for investors, but they have been codified in the concept of stewardship and the stewardship codes, and we will come back to that later. But before we do that, let's go back to the ESG journey. So we have our ES and G that we have defined, but we also have other concepts that are sort of flying around in all this conversation. For example, corporate social responsibility, social responsible investment, impact investment. How do we fit in all these puzzle pieces? So the answer is that, in my view, corporate social responsibility on the company side represents the company's effort to have a positive impact on the employees, the consumers, and the environment. And it is largely a form of self-regulation. ESG, on the other hand, measures the activities that a company implements and carries out to arrive at a more precise assessment of said activities. So the key change is that maybe rather than a speech, than a narrative with a corporate social responsibility, ESG focuses on metrics. ESG demands metrics and is quantifiable and criteria-led. And of course, that opens the door to questions about what are the right metrics, who is using the metrics, who is collating the metrics, what do we do with the raw data, but that's not for today. So that journey from CSR to ESG has happened in the last, I would argue, 20 years. There have been many different entry points in that journey, and what I would like to do next is discuss a few of them to try and bring more clarity as to where we are right now. As far as I know, ESG was first coined in a 2005 report put together by the UN entitled "Who Cares Wins." And this report built on the socially responsible investment movement that had been around for much longer. But unlike socially responsible investment, which is based on ethical and moral criteria and tends to use negative screens, so not investing in alcohol or tobacco, ESG investing was based on the assumption that ESG factors do have financial relevance and that they have to be taken into account as part of the fundamental investment process. Sort of the tagline of the report, and what I think is the key takeaway for us, is that ESG factors make good business sense and that they lead to more sustainable markets and better outcomes, which, by the way, is one of the key tenets of the latest stewardship code, and we will talk about that later. There was another report a couple of years later by the United Nations Environment Programme and Finance Initiative called the Freshfield Report, which showed that ESG issues are relevant for financial valuation. And these two reports led to the launch of the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which was launched under the auspices of the United Nations, which is now a thriving global initiative and whose reporting tool and assessment is widely used and very highly regarded. And the other initiative that came from these reports is the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, which mandates ESG disclosures for listed companies. So we had these sort of mid-2000s happenings coming really more from the social side. And then later on, we also have to consider the Shareholder Rights Directive, very recently the EU Taxonomy, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, all of this bringing yet another level of understanding of why and how ESG issues need to be considered in the financial assessment. Just two more sort of entry points for this journey. One is the Bank of England, which, as you know, has published several letters and reports highlighting that climate change represents a material financial risk for regulated firms. And as I'm sure you will be aware, the 1st of July letter that Sam Wood sent to CEOs, just confirming, telling them, reminding them that firms should have fully embedded their approach to managing climate-related financial risks by the end of 2021. And I think this should be a big trigger for all of us into action. And finally, I wanted to highlight the yearly letters that BlackRock CEO sends to clients. And in the latest one this year, he said that the most significant factor of today in relation to sustainability is climate change. And that is in relation to physical risks, but also in relation to transition risks. That is, how do we transition to a low carbon economy? So how has all this sort of moving from corporate social responsibility to ESG and more recently to sustainability, which I think we can define as sort of an expanded understanding of ESG affected the insurance sector and the investors? Well, I think, in my view, it has affected them through what they need to do with their investment through stewardship. So this is sort of the responsibilities that ESG and sustainability have on the investors. What is stewardship? Well, very broadly defined, is the responsible management of something that has been entrusted to us. More in detail, at company level, stewardship helps to promote high standards of corporate governance, which contribute to sustainable value creation. At the investor level, I think stewardship is about enhancing the long-term value of the investments, which of course have positive impacts on ethical and environmental matters. And then more broadly, in a systemic context, stewardship enhances the overall financial market stability and the economic growth. And again, stewardship has really evolved very rapidly in the last 10 to 15 years. And the first stewardship code appeared in the UK in 2010. Again, it was issued by the Financial Reporting Council. We have a new version now, issued last year, and this is something that I wanted to highlight to the audience, that the first code wanted signatories to report on policies and processes. So what are you doing? But this code is going to measure the impact of the stewardship action. So the questions that we all need to ask ourselves is, how has my stewardship had an impact on the investment? It can be positive, it should be positive, it could also be neutral, but this is, we will, the reports to the FRC need to be in by March 2021, and in Q2 of next year, we will start seeing the first disclosure. So it's an opportunity not to do greenwash and to really show how stewardship efforts have created an impact. So the question of, has ESG become a minimum competence for insurers? I think the answer is yes, absolutely. And then the expectation is, based on that, the expectation is that insurers should have set up, or should be in the process of setting up different dimensions that address this. For example, there should be internal governance practices which specify time horizons for delivering value. There should be stewardship policies that are publicly available. Insurers should be monitoring and assessing investee companies. They should be engaging with them. Voting rights should be exercised whenever it's possible, and close to 100% as it is possible. Insurers should be promoting long-term value creation and integration. And of course, there should be enhanced transparency and disclosure of all of these activities. I'm mindful of the time, so just one last comment on why does ESG matter for insurers? Well, I think society is facing increasingly interconnected and complex environmental and social challenges. And the insurance industry cannot be a bystander, and where appropriate, I think it has to play a role in addressing these challenges as a manager of risk. because failing to do so can have a damaging effect on society, but also on the reputation on the industry. And as you know, ESG has already started to feature prominently on insurers regulatory regime. So we have the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK and in the European Union, which have now made it explicitly clear that they expect insurance companies to model and quantify the impact of ESG factors and climate change in particular in the regular Solvency II stress testing exercises and to report on the results. Finally, one more word on this climate change. That is one of the most high profile and politically topic ESG risk. It has three components, as we've said: physical, transition, and liability. And I think that the insurance industry needs to focus on the second two risks, the transition and the liability risks. From my point of view, the aspiration that I have for the industry is that the industry is able to assess the entire portfolio ESG risk exposure, for example, use ESG triggers to find new investment opportunities, of course, integrate the sustainable development goals, have a very good disclosure and transparency tools, both in annual reporting, but also live on the website, and be very clear about their scenario planning and what that means for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think it's a fascinating journey for all of us, from corporate social responsibility to ESG. Before we, I'll be keen to see if there are any questions from the other panelists, but perhaps just one picking up on one comment you made. You mentioned the BlackRock annual letter, and that this year it's focusing on climate change. I suppose all this is happening because there is a shared understanding across the investment community that thinking about ESG is part of the value creation package. I was wondering if you could comment on the link with the value.
Thank you. No, of course, it is a crucial part of value creation, and I think many strategies now see ESG as an alpha driver. So it's protecting the long term, but it's also there to create additional value. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's fascinating that for once we risk managers are talking about directly value creation as opposed to something else. So thank you. I was wondering if there were any questions from Jean Wee or from Alex.
I do have one, and I think it's around future direction of travel for regulation. You've mentioned things like that there's sort of increasing focus on the regulator on climate change, and also you also mentioned very quickly in passing that there's an EU regulation, which I think you mean that regulation to be the SFDR regulation, right?
Yes.
Now that's a huge amount of detail, I think. And I wondered if you saw the direction of travel for future regulation around ESG to be more of the same, so really delving down to the detail, or are we likely to sort of revert to some more principles-based, more the general top-level regulation?
So I think the direction we're going is going into ever more detail until getting to really the lowest hanging fruit. And I think this is going to happen on climate change to begin with, and the path to a decarbonized economy. And once that has been achieved, I think the regulators will move to the next topic, which could very well be natural capital, sort of biodiversity, for example.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, I'm interested in the S. I feel that the regulators have grasped the governance a long time ago because of various scandals, and environment is very hot. But I feel that COVID has really put a lot of emphasis on S, and I'm just wondering if the regulators and standards setters are going to pick up on that soon.
So I agree. I think the S has been the forgotten child usually, and I also agree that with COVID, the social issues have really come to the front of companies and how companies are run. And we have seen some of these during this proxy season when companies may have been cutting dividends, may have not been making cuts to executive remuneration, but letting people go or not having the adequate protections for health and safety. So given the tsunami we have with climate change and the transition to a decarbonized economy, I personally do not see the regulator tackling social issues as a matter of urgency, even though social has been brought up to the front of the conversation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Justin, I was wondering if there were any questions you wanted to convey from the audience? Rebecca?
Yeah, there's a couple. The first one is around reporting and disclosure, and the question is why should investors trust and value the voluntary reporting of organisations which aren't audited by authorised professional firms?
Right. So very good question. Of course, the data should eventually be audited and certified. But until that is the case, we have to use what we have available. And in addition to that, I think that's also when active ownership can come in very, very handy. Through engagements, you can test and challenge the veracity of the data.
Okay, yeah, there's a further question here, and it's probably quite an interesting one to sort of roll out to others as well, which is kind of is the expectation that insurers implement ESG for their own corporate function or assess ESG in making underwriting decisions in their portfolio? I think it's essentially both, as far as I'm aware, but if you'd like to kind of amplify on that, that'd be great.
No, I agree. It's essentially both. And I think when you've understood that ESG affects both your operations and, as you say, corporate function, but also portfolio management, they kind of come hand in hand, and there will be developments that happen at both levels. Yeah, so just a very quick example, if you're engaging with companies becoming carbon neutral, what are you yourself doing about your headquarters emissions? Do you use renewable electricity? Is your water being recycled? What is your recycling policies, etc.? So I think one influences the other.
I think we've seen examples of where ESG has been applied to only part of the organization, maybe the investment portfolio, and not the underwriting or not the business operations, and that in some ways attracts more negative attention, because we've seen some insurers such as AIG just not engage with the topic at all, whereas others who've got an unbalanced response like Aviva have actually got into more trouble because the investment side is ahead of underwriting and it looks incongruous.
I think my view is that, and I'll expand on this a little bit in my session, but what you do as an organization drives off the values of your organization. And if you feel that it's important to apply ESG to your investment book because you feel particularly strongly about a certain issue, I don't see why you wouldn't necessarily apply that to your underwriting activities.
Okay. Super. Thank you to the three of you for your inputs. Justin, any other questions you wish to convey from the audience?
Yeah, we can pick up another one around the disclosure side, which is really around what does the panel think of the recent statement from SASB and other organisations to work together towards comprehensive corporate reporting, making the point that with all the different regimes, it can be difficult to end up comparing apples with pears. What's your view on where disclosure's at the moment?
Yes, let me get started. This is, of course, one of the main topics of conversations that we have. Disclosures are not comparable, is not like for like, which makes it very difficult really assess where companies do stand in matters of ESG. So from that point of view, I would very much welcome to have a coherent, unified reporting framework for ESG. However, in practice, given the existing fragmentation of reporting frameworks, I do not see yet how this could be possible. So, yeah.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think as somebody trying to implement these kind of programs, the fragmentation is quite difficult to deal with, and you really have to make a choice because we're an organization with limited resources. We can't really afford to try and implement 3 or 4 different standards. So we've had to almost stand back and say, okay, what's important to us? Who are our key stakeholders? And therefore, which one are we going to pick? But there is a danger that we pick the Betamax and not the the market leading standard, and that's an unfortunate position to be put in.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Can we?
Yeah, standardization is always helpful, I feel, and it would certainly cut through a lot of the noise that practitioners in this space face with the tsunami of data and trying to sift through it to find the things you can use to compare one company against another or one portfolio against another. So any sort of initiative in the industry to make disclosures comparable and more aligned, it will improve take up and make practicing sort of ESG integration a lot easier. And there's a lot of effort put in, but the outcome will be, I think, very good.
Okay. Thank you, Jinwei. I think Justin will move on to the next presenter. Yeah. Right. So Jinwei. Jinwei is head of ESG and regulatory and MIG, and he's responsible for formulating and implementing ESG investment strategy for the asset owner. Jinwei has spent 16 years working at the nexus of asset management and insurance, often for life insurers such as Friends Life and AXA. He has held roles in asset allocation, investment strategy, portfolio management, operations, and special projects. Jinwei, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I spent my entire career, almost my entire career, working for an insurance company, and I think thought quite a lot about what an insurer actually does. And if you think about it, the purpose of insurance is social, right? Why do customers buy insurance? Well, it helps them navigate uncertainty and gives them financial security over time. And if you sort of overlay an ESG lens on top, it's quite natural that insurers should care about ESG because ESG factors are sort of they represent risk to society and uncertainty to the future. And by trying to help customers navigate not only financial uncertainty, but also uncertainty presented by ESG factors, which has a financial dimension, it is entirely in keeping the purpose of insurance. And if you sort of think about your customers first, then ESG is logical and natural, and you should sort of integrate that into your business processes across whatever activities you carry out as an insurer. Now, what should the ESG investment objectives for an insurer be? I would suggest they should be customer-led, and you should know your customers and what they want out of their investment book. If you're a life insurer, then it involves sitting down with them and asking them what are their sort of key sources of uncertainty in their lives. If you're a P&C insurer, then there's a sort of separate conversation, which I'm not sure I can shed too much light on. I haven't worked for a P&C insurer in about 12 years now. But again, as customer-led, you have to recognize that preferences change over the long term. So, you know, if you're a life insurer, what your customers want today may not be the same as what they wanted when they bought the policy. So, you know, you have to sort of take that into account. Customer preferences are slow to change, and sometimes the insurer is slightly ahead of the customer. But we are in a time when these preferences are more important because customers are more vocal. But they're also very varied in their preferences. So you know, trading off one set of customer preferences against another is a key consideration. But then, you know, once you've sort of taken all that into account, right, you then think, right, so I need to take account of what ESG means for my customers and put that into my business. And a very helpful way of thinking about it is whether ESG risks are really risks. I think, you know, the way we tend to categorize risks is, first of all, by the impact. So, you know, something's a financial risk or operational risk. And then within those categories, we tend to categorize them by the sources of risks. Now, I think if you sort of carve out ESG and say, right, there's a family of ESG risks, you're not really consistent with that. ESG risks are multidimensional. They have all sorts of impacts. So, for example, say climate change risk and the impact on your business is financial. It's also operational. It's physical. If your corporate estate is located in an area where it's prone to flood, for example, that would be a physical risk. And it's also legal. And so you've got all sorts of dimensions. And if you carve out ESG risk separately as a category at this high level, you know, it doesn't feel quite consistent. What you really want to do is think about the financial impacts of all your risks put together, and then in that you should take into account the financial impacts of the ESG factors or risks that you have in your business. I suggest there's a slightly more helpful way of thinking about it. Now, once you've done that, you then need to sort of think about how you design your portfolios or your investment mandates in order to navigate these risks and manage them in your portfolios. Well, the number of things you can do. I think Rebecca mentioned negative screening. That has its place, I would suggest. And you know, and in some cases, the best way to manage a particular risk is to take it out of the portfolio. But you come to this classic conundrum, which is that the moment you take the risks out of your portfolio, you are unable to manage them, for one thing. And secondly, if you're serious about making the world better for your customers, in some cases, probably most cases, you'd be far better off continuing to hold that security and engaging with the company and change the behavior. For example, you could have a carbon neutral portfolio by selling every carbon heavy stock in your portfolio and only buying forestry companies, for example, as a sort of a facetious example. But that wouldn't necessarily improve the emissions globally, and your customers still face the same risks. So you know, I'll suggest that I'm sure this is a conclusion that a lot of people come to: engagement and trying to influence the company's behavior by means of your holding in that company is the better way forward. Now, you can do this a few different ways. You know, the classic example is that you use your equity holding in the company and your ability to vote those equities in order to influence the company strategy. But I'd say it's more than that. Holding securities in the company buys you contact with the company, and that's true whether or not it's equity or fixed income. The sort of contact points are different. And the sort of, you know, ability for you to set the agenda in those contact points is also different. But nevertheless, they are opportunities to speak to the company as an investor and make your views known. And good engagement strategies leverage off all these contact points, whatever they may be, to try to achieve an outcome. Now, when all else fails, what can you do? Well, everyone, we work in a limited resource world, and you can't engage every single company unless you're BlackRock. But most of us don't work for BlackRock, so you have to sort of pick and choose your battles. And at the end of the day, it may be that you failed to change the company's behavior, and to manage the risk to your portfolio for that particular company, you may wish to sort of dispose of stock. Exclude it complete. I think that's a perfectly valid response, and it can be the sort of least worst way out. One other thing I wanted to touch on was ESG ratings, and I think that I'm not really a fan of them personally. They are helpful. But they're like credit rating, right? They summarize a huge amount of information in an ordinal fashion, so you can rank the various ratings. But it's one number, and it obscures a lot of variation and a lot of nuance. And it's insufficient context to make an informed investment decision. Even the credit ratings is insufficient context. And good investors would have to disentangle and understand the underlying information. I think with ESG ratings, it's even more difficult than credit rating because credit ratings measure default risk, one risk, whereas ESG ratings measure multi-dimensional risks for many factors on something. Normally it's the share price, but it can also be a company's corporate social performance. And so you have to be very careful when interpreting ESG ratings. And I think actually for me, the most helpful thing is not the rating itself. It's the sort of amount of research and thought and information that was gathered by the rating provider in order to arrive at their rating. And using that nuance and sort of complexity behind the rating is very helpful when you design investment strategies, especially if your ESG outcomes are also themselves nuanced and multidimensional. So what does this mean for risk management? Well, I'm not a risk practitioner, so I'm sure a lot of people have more sort of thoughtful ideas on this than I do. But I think that from a person who spent a lot of time dealing with my risk management department about what ESG risks are, it's very complex, and there's a certain amount of education to first understand what the ESG risk is, and I guess as people working in financial services, we are in the main experts in financial services, but ESG risks require assessing ESG risks require a lot of general knowledge about the world, which we as finance professionals aren't necessarily in possession of. So understanding that both myself and my risk manager are laymen, and trying to sort of educate ourselves in the complexities of those risks is probably the first step we should take. Then the more difficult bit, I think, once you've gotten your head around something which is not your specialty, is to put that in context of all the other risks that you face. And I find that extremely challenging because it requires you to have some understanding to some degree of all the other ESG risks. And at the sort of very basic level, it involves a lot of debate and discussion. And I haven't quite found a way around that yet. I think the last thing just asked to sort of give some comments on was a sort of more technical insurance point, which is potentially what are the sort of directions of travel, perhaps for the regulator to sort of put some requirement to report climate risk as part of your solvency capital requirement. I think at some stage it's quite likely. The best way to encourage an insurer to measure and monitor risk is to require them to hold capital against it. But I do think there's a risk of double counting. So as we go back to my example on how we categorize risks, first in terms of impacts, then in terms of sources, quite a lot of risks arising from, say, climate change are already in the SCR. You probably take into account some component in the market risk allowance and the credit risk allowance for example, and trying to disentangle that and move that bit over to the ESG risk component is challenging. And I think there's also a limit to the effectiveness of risk management if you just look at the SCR and use that as a tool. I think climate change is a physical problem. There's no way to limit or drive your exposure to the risks it creates to zero. So you can hold capital against it, but there's by no means as effective a way of managing the risks arising from climate change as it would say, the normal credit risk. Right? If you hold enough capital, you can survive, any level of defaults. But I don't think, it's possible to do that for climate change. I think that's all I had to say, to be honest. So, happy to take questions now or expand on any points that people found interesting.
Thank you, Jinwei. That was a fascinating journey about your perspective as an investment manager. I suppose the one area that we are always all interested to know is a little bit more about perhaps your experience of how boards and senior management understand the ESG insofar as it's your position as an investor. Perhaps you can share some of your experiences on that.
Well, I think that it's a journey for everybody, and I think because the world has changed quite a lot in the last 6 months, it is now on everybody's agenda, and I think that boards and senior management, along with the rest of us, are trying to catch up to understand what this really means for our business, and we are now in a world where we do need to take into account non-financial considerations. How do we do that? And how do we make sure that we are fulfilling our corporate purpose by doing that? And for insurers, it's as I said, to provide financial security for our customers. And it requires boards and senior management to go on that journey I described, where we have to recognize that in many areas, none of us are virologists, for example, or there are very few virologists, also finance practitioners. How do we take into account the impact of COVID and the social consequences of a world where that there is a virus that will not go away unless we have a vaccine? How do we take into account those impacts, very complex impacts, into what is already a very complex business? And recognize that everyone's a layman in such instances, and to try to go on the educational journey to figure out what to do. And I think what my sort of counsel for my stakeholders is that you have to be comfortable that you don't have the full picture. But I know as investment professionals, we all make decisions in the environment of incomplete information. So actually, sometimes these things come quite naturally.
Thank you. I think it's fascinating to see all these links to the purpose of insurance and to the simple recognition that non-financial considerations are really what we're talking about. Rebecca, Alex, I was wondering if you had any thoughts or observations you would like to make. Rebecca?
Yes, hi, thank you. So just curious, Jinwei, about when do you ever exit an investment when the engagement has been unsuccessful? Do you think that ever should be an option?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it comes back to what your corporate values are, I think, and I'm sure there are some companies out there who feel that you have to engage to the nth degree, but I think it's a question of resource, right? So if you have to pick your battles, and if you don't have an army of people able to maintain the dialogue and the contact points with the company, at some point you have to say, well, I'm going to deploy my 10 analysts to a different company where I do have a better chance of changing the behavior, what am I going to do then? Well, I still haven't managed to get this company to stop behaving in what I consider to be an objectionable way, and I have a reputational risk. I don't want to be associated with it. That may be one consideration, or that put quite simply, it produces a financial or non-financial risk that I cannot hedge and is unacceptable for my portfolio. So then what's the best thing to do? Well, I can sell the company.
Thank you.
I think this is interesting, particularly for insurance companies and their assets, because we typically use investment managers. Many insurance companies don't manage their own investments. We have 5 billion of assets, and we're starting to look at this, and we've got some tangible examples where we're starting to track the ESG scores in our portfolios, and it really depends how deep you want to go. So we obviously goes without saying that energy companies are quite often have the most carbon intensive operations, and therefore would have a lower ESG score. But interestingly, that kind of misses the point that some of those energy companies are investing heavily in alternatives and clean energy. And so there is a danger that these scores are real review mirror, kind of looking backwards. And quite often the scores, particularly if there's a scandal of some kind or a supply chain social issue, the scores come down after the event, once the company's already been found out and is cleaning up. So it's not always the most helpful tool to use, but certainly with limited resources, you don't have many other tools, and you don't necessarily have the luxury of a team of ESG analysts to look into it. So I think it is a challenge.
Yeah, Alex, one of the things that one of our questioners has flagged as well is the danger that because ESG screening and investment strategies are still relatively at the early stages, that essentially they promote the flow of funds into the same organisations who are either focused on it from a resource perspective or are very good at managing external expectations, which I thought was an interesting kind of challenge.
Yeah, I do agree with that view, and I'll provide another example of why this is important. So I think one challenge that investors into Asian equities find is that they're not very forthcoming on their ESG strategies. That's not to say they don't have them. They just don't really talk about them. But then if you delve down to what they actually do, sometimes it is quite impressive. And one thing which particularly stuck with me was that I was looking at a number of coal companies and users in China, and they mine and use a lot of coal. That's true. So they're not very they have reasonably high emissions, and they don't have very good ESG scores because of that. But they also install huge amounts of renewable energy capacity, and they probably, if you add it all together, it probably these various companies, less than 10 of them, probably install more renewable energy capacity than, say, the whole of Western Europe. What do you do as an investor trying to sort of achieve the right ESG outcome? You have to kind of look beyond the ESG rating and say, what are these companies actually doing, and what's the outcome that I want? And it may be that in order to achieve the outcome that you want, which is more sort of renewable energy capacity and over time less emissions, you have to live with a poor ESG rating for a while.
Thank you, Jimmy. Justin, are there any other questions from the audience you would like to share?
I think there's a few questions, but they're more kind of general in nature, so I think we can pick them up as we go forward, Isaac.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, Genevieve, for your presentation and for your comments. We will move now to the third slot, which is sorry, control it. Alex Hanson. Sorry. Perfect. Alex Hanson is the Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer at Argo Group. He joined Argo Group as Chief Risk Officer in 2015. He has been responsible for risk management across the group, as well as capital modeling, the relationship with credit rating agencies, and the purchasing of corporate insurances. This year, his role was formally widened to include sustainability and ESG programs. Alex has had a long career in risk management, with Amlin as a CRO of Amlin Swiss operations and head of group risk, and before that as head of enterprise risk management for Aon Global Risk Consulting. And he's also a past chairman of the Institute of Risk Management. So we are delighted to welcome Alex to share with us his journey as a CRO and as an insurer. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. So for various technological reasons, you can't see me, but I've got slides instead. So if Isaac can keep us moving. So as you heard, I am the CRO at Argo, and these are the points I'm going to take you through. So I'm going to move at a reasonable pace, but hopefully the slides give a bit of structure. As you can probably gather, I am the executive member responsible for ESG, and we can discuss why that came about. I'm going to talk about the board and the risk function and the interaction, and also our need to prioritize because we have a limited amount of resource and different stakeholder needs. And I'll actually show you some examples of some reporting. So if we keep moving. Yeah, so I think what I wanted to do was look at this from a sector risk point of view, and then look at it from an Argo point of view. And this was an exercise I was required to do. I recently, during lockdown, did an 8-week program at the University of Cambridge, which I'll touch on at the end. And one of the things it forced you to do was say, okay, what are the risks, ESG risks facing your sector? What are the risks facing your company, and what are you going to do about them? And clearly climate is one of the key risks, and we're in the middle of the wind season and we have wildfires, so it just keeps reinforcing itself, but it affects the investment portfolios as well as the underwriting. I do want to talk about trust. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They actually highlight customer transparency as a key risk that they're interested in. The recent coverage of the issues with business interruption and COVID show that although insurance is essentially a promise to pay, the public isn't always sure they're going to get paid, and they're not that interested in the legal niceties. It's really about perception, and one could argue that insurance industry could have won the court case and still lost, because reputationally we now got a reputation that we don't pay claims. Whether they're valid or not is not really that important to the public. And I think lastly, diversity and inclusion. Clearly there is a need for to address all the issues around diverse workforce, well-being, particularly at this time, and just allowing people to bring their whole selves to work and be respected. So I think those three to me are the key agenda items. They kind of line up with E, S, and G, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. If we turn to the next slide, I'm definitely not going to read every word. This is actually taken from our website and took some time to get our business to agree. But this is really how we as Argo see this. We've linked it to our mission, which is helping businesses to stay in business. And we have highlighted the need for greater transparency. We were probably one of those organizations that didn't say a lot about ESG, a little bit like was mentioned with the Asian companies, not because we were trying to hide anything, but we just didn't see that it was a topic that was as a US stock exchange listed company was something that was normal. But in the last few years, that has definitely shifted, and we are making a concerted effort to share. And we take the view that the world has shifted from a world where if you've got nothing to hide, you have nothing to say, to one where if you don't say anything, you've got something to hide. So we are therefore feeling incentivized to communicate and make those public commitments. So if we move to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of who we think our stakeholders are. We have 3 public ESG ratings, ISS, Morgan Stanley, which is MSCI, and Sustainalytics. Each of them have different importances to us. I'm also highlighting that S&P are in this game, although they tend to not be public ratings. Why is this important? Well, we've kind of heard about that, but it's really because our investors and analysts make decisions on our stock based upon these things. We find that ISS tend to influence our passive shareholders because they are a proxy advisory firm who effectively tell people how to vote in AGMs. And if you spend a moment looking at the press, you would have realized that that was a topic of some importance to us in the last year, and I'll touch on that. Morgan Stanley tend to be used by our active shareholders, and we've had questions from shareholders in investor calls about our MSCI scores. And Sustainalytics work with Glass Lewis, who is another proxy advisory firm. So these have importance. We didn't even know that Sustainalytics were rating us until we approached them. And so it was a little bit of a learning journey. I think we are now in a position where I've convinced my board that it takes more effort to avoid engaging with these people than to engage with them. You actually have to deliberately go out of your way to try not to, because it is basically something that they bring to you. And there is a bit of an industry forming around this, and as we've discussed, there's not really a consolidation around common scoring. And if there are any actuaries on the call, I've seen some information that suggests the correlation between different ESG indices is less than 50%. So it's not terribly helpful if you're trying to make decisions. However, you still have to deal with it. And on the next slide, I'll show you something that we've been working on. We recognize, if we could just flip over. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we don't have the resources to do everything. We have to focus, and if you look into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. I'm not going to try and list them, and I suspect most organizations would not be able to address them all. We have gone through a process of trying to understand which are important to us. As you'll see, climate is not a surprise. We picked out sustainable cities and communities because that's really what insurance does. It puts people back where they were. It encourages resilience. And then really because of the diversity and inclusion agenda, gender equality. So we're trying to stick to our mission and values. We're trying to keep this authentic and deliver some commitments without trying to please everybody. We can't do that. So if I keep going to the next slide. This is something I'm really not going to dwell on very long, but it is a sample. If we can just flip to the next slide. I may have lost Isaac, which might mean I'm a little bit stuck. I'll tell you about it anyway, and we'll get there in a second. So this is our board key risk indicator around ESG, and we track our 3 ESG indices, and we give a kind of one-page summary of where we are, what we need to focus on next, and how do we get to where we want to be. So Justin, are you able to control the slides, or because I think Isaac's looks like a vacant chair to me.
Let me try.
Okay, otherwise I will pause for a second and we can probably move a couple of slides if we're able to. Okay. Ah, he's back. Okay, great. So as I said, I was just trying to show you a summary of how we reported to the board, and then my next couple of slides are really about our journey. So I will pick that up as soon as we're there. Essentially, we set up a sustainability working group in our company in 2016, but it was very low key, and at the beginning of at the end of 2018, we still had what I could best describe as a reactive approach. We had a risk assessment, which I'll touch on. We had an action plan, but what we really lacked was a policy and a strategy, executive sponsorship, and clarity of how this fitted with the business model. So it was a little bit disjointed from everything else. And that's really where we've been focusing most recently. So hopefully one of my friends here will be able to put me back on track. Shall I keep going, or what do you think, Justin?
All right, Alex, just give me 2 minutes and I'll get it on screen for you.
Oh, that's it. Well, so that's where I've just been talking, so that's fine. So if you go to the next one, I'll just keep talking. So really in 2019, what happened as a bit of background is Argo had a very interesting and challenging year. We had an activist shareholder take interest in our company. We had a contested annual general meeting. We had an SEC subpoena, which wasn't disclosed until later in the year. We had involvement with the proxy advisory firms. The CEO left the organization, and about 50% of the board has been refreshed. So that really brought ESG to the forefront. We had a lot of board engagement, and clearly our short-term objective was to get the company out of the limelight and to move out of the fourth quartile in terms of where we stood. And we have focused a lot on the S in ESG, and we have moved our scores fairly dramatically. And we pushed our priorities and have made traction both in terms of the ESG scores we have, but also in terms of the relevance and the engagement internally. If I go to the next slide, I can kind of show you what that looks like in tangible numbers. So if you look at each of the scores, and this is ISS's scorecard, where 1 is excellent and 10 is very poor, and the colors kind of follow. So what I would draw you to look at first is the middle, the S. So we were a 7, and that was largely because we had made no disclosures, and we have significantly enhanced our disclosures, and as you can see, it's now 2, which is actually ahead of most of our peers. On the environment, I would say it's harder work. There aren't as many low-hanging fruit, and it just takes longer to make an impact. And we have now joined the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. We have disclosed our greenhouse gas emissions and set targets, but it all takes a little bit longer to shift those scores. And on the governance side, actually, we went backwards before we came forwards, in the sense that having a contested AGM and a say on pay vote that was tight has lowered our scores. But we have taken all the actions required, and that will wash through in time. And actually, that score has improved in the last 3 months. So it's been a little bit rocky on the governance, but it's given us the, I guess, the drive to improve and the focus. If I flip over to the next slide, what we did do, and we have updated every 6 months for the last while, is we have a threat and opportunity risk assessment. We have listed all the ESG and sustainability issues we face, and we have scored them using a reputational measure. We don't think these are really dollar issues, so it's really, if this event or scenario were to occur, how would our key stakeholder group, of which we've identified these 7, how would they react, and therefore in the overall, how would it be ranked in terms of consequence, which has allowed us to prioritize. If you remember, I said we can't do everything, so we have to rank them. And this is as much about allowing ourselves to not do things as to actively pick things to address. And then if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we focused a lot on is external communication and transparency. We have launched a web page which has been built out over time, and we also published our first ESG annual report. And both have gone a long way to driving stakeholder engagement and actually staff engagement, because we've done quite a few town halls and got a lot of questions from our own staff about these topics. So, and the questions have helped us to improve the disclosure, because it's a kind of a cycle. So just trying to move to the end. What are we doing next? So really, we're now looking at setting targets for 2021, and we're trying to build up a balanced scorecard with key performance indicators and metrics on the simple basis that what gets measured gets done. We are trying to integrate this into our core underwriting, which is where it starts to get tricky, because it takes a lot of effort to gain traction, to impact underwriting decisions, to work on things like fossil fuel statements. And 2 things on the S, diversity and inclusion is a big program that we have running, and also really trying to tap into the benefits, if there are any, of COVID in terms of work-life balance, the future of work, reduced travel footprints, things like that. So two last slides, a bit of advice, and then a resource. So I think don't try and be everything to everybody. Involve your staff. They have lots of good ideas and energy. Pick one of the ESG indices that has the most impact on you, and try and understand how it works, and try and maximize your quick wins. And this is just change management. So who are your stakeholders? What are your objectives? What are your deliverables? And what's your governance? It's I wouldn't say it's simple, but it's as simple as that. It's about managing change. And lastly, I found this resource on the next page particularly helpful. I attended this program by distance learning, and I found it quite helpful. It's not typically something that people from the insurance sector attend, but it was a useful resource.
Thank you, Alex, and apologies for the confusion with the slides. A memo to self plug your telephone to the electricity. I just have a question. I mean, just trying to link what we heard earlier about the stewardship code and the expectations for reporting for 2021. Is that, you mentioned also your first ESG annual report in one of your very last slides. Are these 2 things part of a big plan from you guys? Or would you expect more insurers to do something similar to that in the future?
Yeah, I think that was our first attempt, and we are looking at how we could better integrate that with our annual report from an accounting point of view. I think there's a debate as to whether sustainability reports should be standalone or integrated. I think the other aspect is that some insurers produce an ESG report and a report against a particular standard, like be it SASB or TCFD. We are a member of ClimateWise, and so we already have a type of TCFD report. It happens to be a private disclosure, and we're thinking about what's the right time to make that public. We find that the formal reports like a TCFD report or a UN Principles for Responsible Investment are quite templated and mandated, and therefore not very easy to kind of get your message across through them, which is why we went for a relatively short ESG report, which is more about mission, vision, and values rather than numbers. So I suspect that's where we're going to be. Is going to be some formal documents that have to be submitted, a bit like an ORSA, and something that's more of a communication exercise, separate. But honestly, it's still evolving.
Thank you. And we're 10 minutes away from the end. So I'd like to just ask very briefly to Jean Wee and Rebecca if there are any specific questions you would like to put to Alex.
Thank you. I would have one question for Alex, which is what has been the largest obstacle in this ESG/sustainability journey for you?
Early on, it was really trying to pitch this to not so much the executive but the management community, and get across that this wasn't just greenwashing, that there was some corporate purpose to it. And we overcame that with a little bit of help from MIT Sloan. We were fortunate enough through some contacts to get assigned as a case study to one of their graduate programs, who came and did a review and fed back to us really our strengths and weaknesses, and that was helpful in getting across to people that there was business benefit from this in terms of particularly on the S side, in terms of talent attraction and retention. And that if we didn't do something, then we were actually going to have to spend conscious effort avoiding it, which was quite a good argument. And I think things started to turn when our investor relations got a lot of questions, and it was causing pain, and therefore doing something was a positive contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any thoughts from you?
Perhaps a question which is actually quite close to my heart, which is that you mentioned consulting staff, and yes, I agree that that's extremely important. But did you encounter any situations where the staff disagreed strongly with each other? And if so, what did you do to try to resolve that?
Yes, I think we, particularly on the climate, you can get into some quite interesting semi-political debates. We have some parts of the business that underwrite energy-related business, so it can be close to people's hearts to be pro or anti fossil fuels, effectively. And I think what we really needed to do was to put it into context and explain to staff that we were a listed company there were certain expectations on us, and that we needed to behave in a certain way, and that we weren't necessarily going to make dramatic changes, but we needed to consult them and other stakeholders to reach a position where we had a coherent strategy around this, and that burying our head in the sand wasn't a strategy. So I think people started to respect openness. So we've had a lot of disclosure, and it's linked to the diversity and inclusion agenda, because you can't really include people if you're not telling them what's going on. So we've had several town halls just airing the topic. One of our town halls was devoted to racism as a topic. We had 3 external speakers, and they tackled some pretty challenging issues. So I think it needs to be managed as a process, but I think we're trying to engage rather than avoid some of these challenging topics.
Thank you, Alex. I think, Justin, if you can convey any questions from the audience and wrap up directly. I won't say anything else, but just thank you to the 3 speakers for your contributions.
That's great. Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, thank you to the speakers. I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time. There's a couple of things that I'd like to do. Firstly, just to get some snap feedback on the session, but also to pick up on any future areas that you might want to focus on. I think we're thinking that probably we obviously haven't done justice to what is a very broad and a very difficult topic in this time, but I think there's certainly the potential for more. So firstly, it'd be helpful if you can rate your views on this webinar. That would be great. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. And then secondly, just in terms of going back to the picture that Isaac showed up earlier, get a sense from you of which of these are ESG topics you'd be interested in hearing more about. You can select more than one option, not just one. If you could give that your attention, that would be very helpful. Okay, thank you very much for your attention on that. I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time. I did want to put in front of you future topics and get your perspectives on them. Unfortunately, I think we're probably out of time to do that. So what I'll do instead is I'll make sure that that's put up on the IRM website and circulated around for you to give your views and perspectives on. In the meantime, I think it's just for us to say thank you to the panelists and to all of you for your participation and for your active questions as we've been going through. And thanks again for attending and making it a great webinar. Thank you. We'll close there.